It's a Saturday, so happy weekend. Look like my headphone is kind of unsteady, but isn't it kind of weird that we are having a specific type of weekend, and on the other side of the world, um, in Ukraine specifically, they are having a very different kind of weekend, and the state of the reality is so random. I mean, you know, right in this moment, everyone is experiencing something different, um, and which is sort of like a you know good and bad. Because first of all, if everyone is experiencing something different, that means there are like different versions to this moment, right? Um, and on top of that, when we try to live or try to kind of project or see how the reality looks from someone else's standpoint, uh, you can find a new lens or a new window into your own life. Maybe that's why at times it's super painful to follow up on everything going on in the world, right? Especially now when the information is accessible so easily. Uh, anyone um, with the right technology, I guess, or right device can just access the wealth of this information, and this information um, um, you know could feel different to different people. um, and that's where I bet like a lot of the confirmation bias come into picture as well, because people are looking for a specific type of information, and when they find it online, they think that's the truth, even though online everything online is obviously not true. And that also include the Wikipedia page, which we go over uh, almost every other day. And even though I know that every random Wikipedia article I'm going through is not 100% accurate, I still believe that it's uh, it's more probable than improbable. You know what I mean? Like the articles, the Wikipedia articles are sort of cited to different sources, and those sources could be like a news agency, or I don't know what is the filtering mechanism of every author um, of Wikipedia or wikis, I guess. But whatever it might be, those sources um, sort of um, paint the picture or kind of create this narrative on the Wikipedia. And depending on how trustworthy those sources are, the Wikipedia article itself will be more trustable or not. So for the sake of our um, time as well as sanity, I guess, um, I'm gonna just assume that 80% of everything on Wikipedia is probable. or everything on the Wikipedia is 80% probable. How about that? Um, and there are still going to be elements which are not factually right, or which are taken out of context, or um, or maybe willfully maligned. So there could be multiple reasons, but regardless of that, I find this mechanism useful because, first of all, no one knows what the entire truth is, and the pursuit of that truth itself is science, right? I mean, but science is limited only to specific vectors, like, say, the physical science, the physics part of it, the chemical science, the chemicals part of it, and then the biological and psychological itself is a vast variation. There is no one way of there is no one way to categorize that this is the truth when it comes down to psychological science, if you even can call it a science. But physical laws are true for everyone, regardless of the size, regardless of the the demograph, right? Or regardless of the understanding of that information or knowledge itself. Like gravity hits everyone same, regardless of if that person knows the concept of gravity, basically. But here's a part of that. Uh, the science is the pursuit of the truth, the reality, or at least as close as we can get to the reality. And reality itself is constantly shifting. I mean, but again, some of the physical science, it will still be applicable. It doesn't matter if reality itself is changing. Like, if the culture is changing, regardless of the culture changing, regardless of um, the the, the political structure changing, the physical laws of the electromagnetic laws, or the gravitational laws, or um, even the space-time laws, these are all going to remain constant. But chemical laws, those are changeable. Those are very, even though we can predict accurately, or even accurately create specific type of chemical, but because the ecology, or not just the ecology per se, but also the the creation of the planet could have a different chemistry, right? So every planet can have different chemistry, and on top of that, how far that planet is from their respective star sort of create different dynamics. So, there are so many different variables and factors which create the chemical reality. Uh, and maybe that's why a lot of people even have um, hard time understanding the concept of climate crisis, right? Because there are so many different variables, and chemistry being one of the biggest variable, or one of the biggest factor, right? So obviously there are see there are psychological effect when it comes down to climate crisis, uh, which are gonna impact people in so many different ways. The stress of losing, say, losing their losing the stability of their life, let's just say that, or even stress because of the seasonal changes, because because of climate crisis, the summer are getting hotter and the winter are getting chillier, and on top of that, a lot of the weather related events are becoming more and more, um, I would say, dangerous, I guess. So all of those factors um, causing stress to the people, and that is physiological, well, that is psychological change, psychological stress, but I'm sure there is physiological stress surrounded with that too, because if there are like a wildfire, then obviously you're going to experience psychological stress and physical stress, because you have to make sure that everything around you, as well as your house and your family and everyone, are safe. So um, the climate crisis already creating psychological, physiological stress, and on top of that, the whole um, um, complicated chemistry of gases, of the carbon we are emitting, all the carbon we are emitting, we as a human, and and some of that is unavoidable, meaning, as long as you're alive, you will be emitting carbon. uh, so that's a part of your reality, and that's part of your truth. The difference is you have control over how much uh, carbon you sort of emit, I guess. Well, saying carbon is probably not a right word, or not a right sentence, but uh, total um, the greenhouse gases you are emitting, and we do emit a lot, directly as well as indirectly. um, with indirectly, there are like so many different things, like even like right now, the electricity that's coming from some source, and that's the fossil fuels, and those fossil fuels are emitting carbon. So well, again, not carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. So the electricity is like, this is my indirect impact on the climate, and then there are direct impact on the climate, and that could be I mean, it could be minimal, it could be a lot, depending on the person, I guess. But for example, if if I'm eating a lot and I'm farting a lot, that fart is adding carbon to the environment. And the cow's fart right now is a big deal in the overall climate crisis, I guess, because uh, cows fart methane, and I'm not sure what other people or other beings fart. Probably we fart, like, combination of that as well. But but because of animal farming, because humans need so much food, we end up create this meat industry, right? And that meat industry consumes a lot of water. That meat industry also produce a lot of you know greenhouse gases, and some could be literally traced down to cow farts. So at a personal level, you and I, we all fart. So that is a contributor to the environment. But obviously, it's not a larger degree. I mean, it hardly make any impact, But we do, uh, we do act in a certain way which directly add more carbon to the environment as well. For example, if you if you say, uh, if you ever burnt a firewood, that is a direct action, and that is adding carbon, to the environment. And let alone, like, using the whole petrol and diesel and other oil to kind of function in our day-to-day life. So all of that is um, you know adding a carbon footprint to the overall crisis. So this is unavoidable. The only thing we can do is minimize how much carbon we are adding to the environment. And everyone, I think everyone are good enough or smart enough or wise enough to know um, what their line is, I guess. Um, and but all of us kind of fail to stay on that line, I guess. Because I'm guilty of you know uh, wasting some of the uh, some of the things, or adding more carbon to the environment because of my, say, laziness, or because uh, because I say pushed it till the last second, and now I have no choice but to kind of say, somehow add more to the environment, whatever may be the reason. But the point being that we all gonna be impacting the climate, and climate is complex. And climate, the major part of the climate crisis is the chemicals, the complexity of the chemicals and the chemical laws, which dictate, our ecological changes, I guess. But these are all, to a certain degree, calculatable. But one thing which is unpredictable, but also, well, like, I believe human behavior is one of those anomalies, because it's unpredictable but also predictable. Because a lot of because we are um, um, we are result of our patterns, right? So we love to do things, and repeat doing the same things, like in patterns, and that makes us predictable. At the same time, we have this option and ability, and at times even courage, to break out of those patterns, and that makes us unpredictable. So it's that's why I guess, to a certain degree, humans are fascinating, and I'm sure this is true for a lot of other animals as well. A lot of other animals must be predictable, because of their repeated patterns, but unpredictable in the moment. You never know what they could do. So yeah. Well, let's start our uh, today's session of random Wikipedia article. So it's pretty straightforward. What we're gonna do is, we're gonna let the randomness of AI decide which article we're gonna start with, and we're gonna do that by using this random article option over here. And this way, we'll use the beauty of randomness. But before that, in the news is that Russia launches an invasion of Ukraine. Wow. So this was the point I was making earlier that, the uh, in a in a city not too far, well, when I say not too far, it's still thousands of miles, but um, on the other side of our planet, the situation, the reality is so different that at times make me appreciate what's happening in my life, but at the same time, there are so many things in my life which are taking its own turn. Anyhow, let's see which article the randomness decides. Well, we're going to talk about Civil Rights Memorial. That sounds pretty interesting topic. The Civil Rights Memorial is an American memorial in Montgomery, Alabama, created by Maya Lin. The names of 41 people are inscribed on the granite fountain as martyrs who were killed in the civil rights movement. The memorial is sponsored by the Southern Poverty Law Center. Design. The names included in the memorial belong to those who were killed between 1955 and 1968. Those dates were chosen because in 1956, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that racial segregation in schools was unlawful, and 1968 is the year of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. The monument was created by Maya Lin, who is best known for creating the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. The Civil Rights Memorial was dedicated in 1989. The concept of Lin's design is based on the soothing and healing effect of water. It was inspired by a passage from King's I Have a Dream speech. We will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. The quotation in the passage, which is inscribed on the memorial, is a direct paraphrase of Amos 5:24, as translated in the American Standard Version of the Bible. The memorial is a fountain in the form of an asymmetric inverted stone cone. A film of water flows over the base of the cone, which contains the 41 names included. It is possible to touch the smooth film of water and to alter it temporarily, which quickly returns to smoothness. As such, the memorial represents the aspirations of the civil rights movement to end legal racial segregation. Civil rights martyrs. So these are the 41 names included in the memorial. And then the forgotten are 74 people who are identified in a display at the Civil Rights Memorial Center. these names were not inscribed on the memorial because there was insufficient information about their deaths at the time the memorial was created. However, it is thought that these people were killed as a result of racially motivated violence between 1952 and 68. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna try to learn about all of these people. Louis Allen was an African American businessman in Liberty, Mississippi, who was shot and killed on his land during the civil rights era. He had previously tried to register to vote and had allegedly talked to federal officials after witnessing the 1961 murder of Herbert Lee, an NAACP. Willie Brewster. On the evening of July 13th, 1965, Hubert Damon Strange shot Willie Brewster as Brewster drove past him on Highway 202 outside Anniston, Alabama. 2 days later, Brewster died in a hospital. In December of that year, Strange was convicted of second-degree murder. Benjamin Brown was an African American student at Jackson State University, active in the civil rights movement, killed on campus during a standoff between law enforcement and students. Upon encountering the standoff after picking up a sandwich from a cafe to bring back to his wife, he was shot. Johnny May Chappell. Johnny May Chappell was an American murder victim during race riots in Jacksonville, Florida, killed by a gunshot from a passing car. After evidence and documents went missing, her killer was charged with manslaughter, only serving 3 years in the prison. And the other passengers were probably got fewer than 3 years sentence. James Earl Cheney was one of 3 Congress of Racial Equality civil rights workers killed in Philadelphia, Mississippi by the members of the Ku Klux Klan on June 21st, 1964. The others were Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner from New York City. Addie Mae Collins. The 16th Church Baptist Church bombing. The 16th Street Baptist Church bombing was a white supremacist terrorist bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, on Sunday, September 15, 1963. 4 members of a local Ku Klux Klan chapter planted 19 sticks of dynamite attached to a timing device. And I bet Addie Mae Collins is one of these girls. Vernon Ferdinand Damer Sr. was a leader in the civil rights movement and president of the Forest County chapter of the NAACP in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. He was murdered by the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan for his work on recruiting African Americans to vote. Jonathan Myrick Daniels was an Episcopal seminarian and civil rights activist. In 1965, he was murdered by a shotgun wielding Special County Deputy Tom Coleman, who was a construction worker in Hayneville, Alabama, while in the act of shielding 17-year-old Ruby Sales. Henry Hezekiah D. Mississippi Cold Case in a 2007 feature documentary produced by David Ridgen of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation about the Ku Klux Klan murders of two 19-year-old young black men, Henry Hezekiah D. and Charles Eddie Murray, in southwest Mississippi in May 1964 during the Civil Rights Movement. Roman Duxworth Jr. was an African American military police officer shot and killed as a hate crime by Taylorsville, Mississippi police as he was heading to the hospital expecting his sixth child. Willie Edwards Jr. was a 24-year-old African American husband and father who was murdered by members of the Alabama Ku Klux Klan. He is buried at New Pleasant Valley Cemetery in Lithohatchee, Alabama. Medgar Willie Evers was an American civil rights activist and the NAACP's first field secretary in Mississippi who was assassinated by a white supremacist. Evers, a decorated U.S. Army combat veteran who had served in World War II, was engaged in efforts to overturn segregation. Andrew Goodman was an American civil rights worker. He was one of three civil rights movement workers murdered during Freedom Summer in Philadelphia, Mississippi in 1964 by members of the Ku Klux Klan. And he looks white, so Ku Klux Klan killed even white people. I mean, I'm not surprised. Paul L. Guihard was a French-British journalist for Agence France Presse. He was murdered in the 1962 riot at the University of Mississippi while covering the events surrounding James Meredith's attempts to enroll at the all-white university, the only journalist known to have been killed in the riot, I believe. Samuel Hammond Jr. The Orangeburg Massacre refers to the shooting of protesters by South Carolina Highway Patrol Highway Patrol. The Orangeburg Massacre refers to the shooting of the protesters by South Carolina Highway Patrol officers in Orangeburg, South Carolina, on the South Carolina State University campus on the evening of February 8, 1968. About 200 protesters had previously demonstrated against racial segregation. Jimmy Lee Jackson was an African American civil rights activist in Marion, Alabama, and a deacon in the Baptist Church. On February 18, 1965, while unarmed and participating in a peaceful voting rights march in his city, he was beaten by troopers and fatally shot by an Alabama something. Wallace Jackson was the treasurer of the Natchez, Mississippi branch of the NAACP until his assassination by a car bomb, which was placed on the frame of his trunk under the driver's side seat. The bomb exploded at approximate 8 p.m. on February 27, 1967. Martin Luther King Jr., an African American clergyman and civil rights leader, was fatally shot at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee on April 4, 1968 at 6:01 p.m. CST. He was rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital where he died at 7:05 p.m. He was a prominent leader of the civil rights movement. Reverend Bruce W. Clunder was a Presbyterian minister and civil rights activist born in Colorado, United States. He died when he was run over by a bulldozer while protesting the construction of a segregated school in Cleveland, Ohio. George Wesley Lee was an African American civil rights leader, minister, and entrepreneur. He was a vice president of the Regional Council of Negro Leadership and head of the Belzoni, Mississippi branch of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Herbert T. Lee was an American civil rights activist in Mississippi, remembered as a proponent of voting rights for African Americans in that state, who had been dis- and disenfranchised since 1890. He was a charter member of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Viola Fauver Liuzzo was an American civil rights activist. In March 1965, Lizzo heeded the call of Martin Luther King Jr. and traveled from Detroit, Michigan to Selma, Alabama, in the wake of the Bloody Sunday attempt at marching across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Dennis McNair, same as Eddie May. Delano is one similar to Yeah, Samuel Hammond Jr. and Delano Delano Herman Middleton. They were killed in the same massacre. Charles Eddie Murray and one other person. Who was it? Yeah, Henry Hezekiah D. and Charles Eddie Murray. They both were killed in the same, yeah, same massacre. O'Neill Moore was the first African American deputy sheriff for the Washington Parish Sheriff's Office in Varnado, Louisiana. He was murdered on Wednesday, June 2nd, 1965, by alleged members of the Ku Klux Klan in a drive by shooting, 1 year and a day after his landmark appointment as deputy sheriff. William Lewis Moore was a postal worker and Congress of Racial Equality member who staged lone protest against racial segregation. He was assassinated in Keener, Alabama, during a protest march from Chattanooga, Tennessee, to Jackson, Mississippi. Mac Charles Parker was an African American victim of lynching in the United States. He had been accused of raping a pregnant white woman in northern Pearl River County, Mississippi. 3 days before he was to stand trial, Parker was kidnapped from his jail cell in the Pearl River County and then murdered. Lemuel Augustus Penn was the assistant super superintendent of Washington D.C. public schools, a decorated veteran of World War II and a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army Reserve who was murdered by members of the Ku Klux Klan 9 days after passage of the Civil Rights Act. How in the world is KKK patriotic? They killed veterans. They killed army members. James Joseph Reeb was an American Unitarian Universalist minister, pastor, and activist during the civil rights movement in Washington, D.C. and Boston, Massachusetts. While participating in Selma to Montgomery March's actions in Selma, Alabama in 1965, he was murdered. John Earl Reeves was an African American teenager who was murdered in Gregg County, Texas. Carol Robertson, along with Dennis McNair and Addie Mae Collins. Michael Henry Mickey Schuwerner was one of 3 Congress of Racial Equality field workers killed in rural Neshoba County, Mississippi by members of the Ku Klux Klan. Schuwerner and two co-workers, James Chaney and Andrew Goodman, were killed. So Michael Schumer, Andrew Goodman, somewhere here, yeah. And James Chaney. And Henry Ezekiel Smith is tied to the Orangeburg Massacre, which also had Samuel Hammond Jr. and Delano Herman Middleton. Lamar Ditney Smith was an American civil rights figure, African American farmer, World War One veteran, and an organizer of black voter registration. In 1955, he was shot dead in broad daylight around 10 a.m. At close range on the lawn of the Lincoln County Courthouse. Emmett Louis Till was a 14-year-old African American who was lynched in Mississippi in 1955 after being accused of offending a white woman in her family's grocery store. The brutality of his murder and the fact that his killers were acquitted drew attention to the long history. Clarence Triggs was a married African American bricklayer and veteran who was murdered on July 30th, 1966 in Bogle, Bogalusa, Louisiana. After a month, about a month after participating in a civil rights march for voting, two white men were arrested and indicted in the case. One was acquitted and the other never something. Virgil Lamar Ware was an African American eighth grader shot to death after the Birmingham church bombing. So Cynthia Wesley is the fourth one. Cynthia Wesley, along with Dennis McNair and Addie Mae Collins. Ben Chester White was a black caretaker, uninvolved in the civil rights movement, shot down by the KKK. This was likely in an attempt to move focus away from James Meredith's March Against Fear or to lure Martin Luther King Jr. in an assassination attempt. This murder went unnoticed. Samuel Lemon Young Jr. was a civil rights and voting rights activist who was murdered for trying to desecrate a whites only restroom, desegregate a whites only restroom. Young was an enlisted service member in the United States Navy, where he served for 2 years before being medically discharged. And the forgotten Andrew Lee Anderson, Frank Andrews, Isadore Banks, Larry Bolden, James Brazier, Thomas Brewer, Hilliard Brooks, Charles Brown, Jesse Brown, Carrie Brumfield, Eli Brumfield, Silas Ernest Caston, Clarence Cloninger, Willie Countryman, Vincent Damon, Woodrow Wilson Daniels, Joseph Hill Dumas, Feld Evans, J. E. Evanston, Matty Green, Jasper Greenwood, Jimmy Lee Griffith, A. C. Hall, Rogers Hamilton, Collie Hampton, Alfonso Harris, Iselle Henry, Arthur Junior Hill, Ernest Hunter, Luther Jackson, Ernest Giles, Joe Franklin Jeter, Marshall Johnson, John Lee, Willie Henry Lee, Richard Lillard, George Love. Robert McNair, Mabel Mahone, Sylvester Maxwell, Clinton Melton, James Andrew Miller, Booker T. Mixon, Nehemiah Montgomery, Frank Morris, James Earl Motley, Sam O'Quinn, Hubert Orsby, Larry Payne, C. H. Pickett, Albert Pitts, David Pitts, Ernest McFarland, Ernest McFarland, Jimmy Powell, William Roy Prather, Johnny Quinn, Donald Raspberry, Fred Robinson, Johnny Robinson, Willie Joe Sanford, Marshall Scott Jr., Jesse James Shelby, W. G. Singleton, Ed Smith, Eddie James Stewart, Isaiah Taylor, Freddie Lee Thomas, Salim Trix, Hubert Warner, Clifton Walker, James Weimers, John Wesley Wilder, Rodell Williamson, Archie Wooden, Thomas Hensey Brewer Sr. was an African American physician born on November 1894 in Saco, Alabama, who was instrumental in the civil rights movement in Columbus, Georgia, during the early to mid 20th century before he was assassinated in 1956. Larry Payne was a 16-year-old African American teenager who was killed following a march in support of the Memphis sanitation strike on Thursday, March 28, 1968. In Memphis, Tennessee, he was the only fatality on that day, although the New Pittsburgh Courier report Jimmy Powell. The Harlem Riot of 1964 occurred between July 16 and 22, 1964. It began after James Powell, a 15-year-old African American was shot and killed by police Lieutenant Thomas Gilligan in front of Powell's friends and about a dozen after other witnesses. Wow. Johnny Robinson was a young African American teenager who, at age 16, was shot and killed by a police officer in the unrest following the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham, Alabama. Robinson and several others were allegedly throwing rocks at his car draped with a something. This country went through so much suffering, and I bet like every country in the world had their own share of suffering, but but like the I mean, I would feel wrong to compare any injustices, because I know how um, injustice, um, how they were like, unjust systems everywhere throughout the world. There was in the United States where there was slavery, where the rich um, white farmers at the time, they used to they used to profit out of the manpower of their slaves slash property. So they used to cause so much injust to the black community. Likewise, in India, there is a caste system which uh, which has taken away a lot of dignity, at the very least. And they were they were sort of slaves in caste system as well, because the worker class, the worker caste rather, they all of their children are automatically treated as workers caste, so they cannot exit out of that working profession. So they were trapped in this own set of generational slavery, where people cannot move, and they were stuck to do some menial job for the people with higher caste. So it's not that there weren't like unjust system in India, or I'm sure we can, if we trace back, we can find different unjust systems in every civilization. and and today's problem is that a lot of people are still holding on to those unjust systems, like some people are holding on to that unjust system because that make their life meaningful. These are the people who are overly patriotic, who are like supremacist, whether it's like based on their color or based on the religion or whatever crazy ideas they may have. So there are people who are hanging on to those unjust system because those benefit them. And on the other end, there are people who are still hanging on to these unjust system because it these unjust system make them feel victim, and to a certain degree, uh, you know, um, they're able to blame it on others, right? So, for example, let me think about an example from the from the left standpoint, right? If I let's just say the weirdest thing. Let's just talk about say um PETA, right? I am vegetarian. I'm a lifelong vegetarian, and I uh, I choose not to eat meat out of principle because that's where I draw the line. Everyone had their own lines. That's where I draw the line, right? So I kind of aligns with where PETA um, uh, sort of like stands, when it comes down to animal cruelty. But a lot of these people who not only find satisfaction in being morally, say, right, in their mind at least, like um, that they are doing the right thing by not eating other animals or not harming other animals. But when they start, um, when they start uh, claiming that they are the victim, meaning that the people should listen to them, for example, right? Again, this is not a good example. I'm not able to come with any other example, but the point being that there are people on both sides. There are people who gonna be trying to latch on to the old systems because it profits them, and there are people who will latch on to the old systems because that becomes an excuse to not take responsibility and just hang on to something and feel victim, and that victimization uh, may I don't know, might help them in some way. But regardless, these two sets of people are still hanging on to the past instead of like living in the present and understanding the situation on the ground today, and what laws should we be using and leveraging. And uh, to be honest, at the moment it's it's so chaotic. The Congress in United States are so many decades behind the country. The country to a larger degree have to like wait for years for the laws to catch up. And we can see that in more openly now in the digital era, because most of the government doesn't even know what to do with the software industry and the entire new avenue uh, of interaction or communication with the people, right? So government have no clue how to uh, how to make sure that that there are like legal protections, say, for everyone, right? uh, uh, for example, the privacy laws, like government have no idea what's going on. Like so many companies are easily able to steal your data, and they can leverage that data to target ad you to to kind of like target you with like a specific ads, for example, or even sell your data to the black market, and from there, they spam your say mailbox or your inbox or whatever. And the government have no clue. And I shouldn't say no clue, but government don't know what to do. Like the Congress are years behind, and by the time Congress catches up, uh, I bet there would be like a completely different level of technology. Let's just say that. For example, I bet it took a Congress or the government to catch up to say the what to do with the printing press. Like once there were like a lot of I would imagine, I don't know if it's true, but I would imagine that when there were a lot of people who had access to the printing press, they can just print whatever they wanted to, and they can just like distribute it wherever they wanted to. So maybe after that, like government sort of came up with some level of regulation, or something, um, like what should be the standards of newspapers, what is considered as news, and what isn't. Meaning, the newspapers may have to have, say, journalists who actually have a degree from a journalism schools or whatever they have, and something on that line. Maybe like practicing with license of a sort. So, and that's what government do, right? Like when it comes down to say doctors, especially and lawyers, they have their licenses, and those licenses um, basically tells you that, okay, this person is approved by the government to do whatever they are doing, to practice law or to practice medicine, and that that helps you to put your trust into that physician or that lawyer to handle whatever your case might be. And without government doing that, there there would be millions of people. Millions might be exaggeration, but there would be hundreds of thousands of people who would just fake being a doctor, and and would just outright con you for money. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. Even with the current level of security measures we have in place, there are a lot of con men who pose as, say, doctor or lawyer or pilot or president, and like just exploit people. So people, there are con men or con women and con people, I guess. Uh, but yeah, yeah. So that's where government's license sort of like help out people to trust that entity. So anyhow, um, it's 3:30, and I'm a bit tired. I'm tired for a lot of reasons, and I do feel that I need a good night's sleep, because there are times when my mind stops working, and the feeling, right? Like when you're spiraling through a negative thought, for example, and you're like just spiraling down through it, and maybe sleeping helps. And I'll be honest, like I'm not catching a lot of sleep for um, you know for for the past, I don't know, weeks or months even. And I feel that I feel that it's an injustice to myself, because I know that with optimal sleep and exercise and other like diet and other things, I know that I can feel the optimum level of my health, and not doing that is sort of like an injustice to myself. So I'm the victim of my own actions or inactions, and I am responsible for that. And even though I know that I'm responsible, I do still feel like a victim of my own response, of my own inactions. But it's, I don't know. I was trying to end this on a positive note, but that might take a little more time because I'm already sleepy, tired, and on top of that, like I'm already high. So uh, the words are taking its own time to appear in my brain, and even when they do appear, at times they lose the continuation of my thought, and that leave me stranded with no no topic to talk about. Oh, okay. But one thing I want to say is that I'll be back tomorrow with uh, with another random Wikipedia article, and until then,